What if I told you that right now, as we speak, the Kremlin is launching its most aggressive military recruitment campaign since the beginning of the invasion? We're not talking about minor adjustments or routine procedures. We're witnessing what can only be described as a massive human harvest, a desperate scramble to find 135,000 fresh bodies to throw into the meat grinder of Ukraine. This isn't just another seasonal draft announcement. This represents something far more sinister happening behind the polished walls of the Kremlin. The Russian war machine is literally bleeding out on the battlefields of eastern Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin has just signed what might be his most desperate decree yet, an order to sacrifice 135,000 of his own nation's youth in a futile attempt to plug the endless holes in his collapsing military strategy. But here's what they desperately don't want you to see behind all the official statements and carefully worded press releases. This massive conscription reveals terrifying truths about Russia's actual military capabilities and the true cost of this disastrous war. We're going to pull back the curtain and show you the grim reality behind these numbers. A reality of systematically broken promises, hidden casualty figures that would shock the world, and the looming threat of a permanent year-round conscription system that could transform Russian society forever. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you view this conflict and understand the desperate measures being taken to sustain it. Let's start with the raw, shocking facts that should make every international observer deeply concerned. In late September 2025, President Vladimir Putin personally put his signature on the document authorizing this enormous autumn conscription campaign. The target? 135,000 Russian citizens between the ages of 18 and 30, what should be the brightest years of their lives. But these aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. Each digit represents a young person whose future is being sacrificed for a failing military adventure. This isn't merely another seasonal draft, it's the largest autumn call-up Russia has witnessed in nearly a decade, signaling a level of institutional panic and desperation we haven't seen since the darkest days of this conflict. The official timeline shows the conscription period stretching from October 1st straight through to December 31st, 2025. On the surface, this fits neatly into Russia's traditional biannual military draft cycle that's been in place for years. But this is precisely where Moscow's carefully constructed narrative begins to completely unravel under even the slightest scrutiny. The Ministry of Defense in Moscow is working overtime, spinning a particular story for both domestic consumption and international observers. They're aggressively insisting that this represents nothing more than routine conscription, deliberately avoiding the more alarming term mobilization that would signal a major escalation. They're making solemn promises, officially on the record, claiming these young men will perform their military service exclusively within Russia's sovereign territory, kept safely away from the deadly front lines in Ukraine. They want you to believe this is just normal military business proceeding as usual. But we have mounting evidence from multiple reliable sources that tells a very different, much darker story. One that contradicts every comforting assurance coming from official Russian channels. Multiple independent media sources, including the Kiev Independent and the Moscow Times, have been documenting a horrifying reality that completely undermines Moscow's official position. Ukrainian officials consistently report discovering recent Russian conscripts among their prisoners of war, and tragically, among the dead recovered from various battlefields across eastern and southern Ukraine. This evidence systematically demolishes the Kremlin's persistent facade of these draftees performing safe rear-duty positions far from combat zones. Even within Russia itself, despite intense media censorship, alarming personal accounts are gradually emerging through social media and independent journalists. These are disturbing stories of young men who initially signed up for what they believed were training positions or logistical support roles, only to find themselves suddenly handed assault rifles and forcibly dispatched to the most dangerous trench positions under suspicious contract arrangements that they never properly consented to. This isn't just bureaucratic confusion or administrative errors. This appears to be a deliberate, calculated deception orchestrated at high levels to meet personnel quotas without triggering widespread public resistance. This record-breaking draft actually forms part of a much larger, more ambitious plan by the Kremlin to dramatically expand Russia's standing military to an astonishing 1.5 million active personnel by 2026. Let that enormous number truly sink in for a moment. We're talking about creating one of the largest standing armies in modern history during peacetime conditions. Just this past spring, Moscow already managed to pull in approximately 160,000 new recruits, which itself set a recent record for spring conscription numbers. Military analysts and Russia watchers observing the situation are unequivocal. This frantic expansion isn't about building a future-oriented modern army. It represents a desperate last-ditch attempt to compensate for catastrophic battlefield losses that have decimated Russia's professional military units over nearly 3 years of intense combat. They're essentially trying to replace the tens of thousands of experienced soldiers who've already been killed, wounded, or captured in this disastrous war. But here's the crucial point that should terrify every young Russian man and their family. What we're seeing right now might represent just the beginning of an even larger human tragedy. A radical legislative proposal is currently being actively discussed in the Russian parliament that would completely scrap the traditional seasonal draft system that's been in place for decades. The plan would establish a year-round conscription apparatus starting as early as 2020 2026. This revolutionary change would provide the Kremlin with ultimate flexibility to continuously feed its voracious war machine with fresh human resources literally anytime it wants, rather than being constrained to just 2 drafting periods per year. It would effectively create a permanent, uninterrupted pipeline of young men destined for the front lines, waiting on standby to be tapped whenever military commanders demand more cannon fodder. This isn't just a theoretical discussion, this legislation is being seriously considered right now, which means the current draft might be just the beginning of a much larger, more systematic human tragedy unfolding in slow motion. The timing of this massive draft is particularly revealing. It comes after months of intense fighting that has seen Ukrainian forces making gradual but steady gains in several sectors of the front line. Military analysts suggest that Russian defensive lines have been stretched dangerously thin, with some units reporting severe personnel shortages that compromise their combat effectiveness. The decision to call up 135,000 men now suggests that Russian military planners recognize they need to reinforce these positions before winter conditions complicate military operations further. But there's another dimension to this timing that's equally concerning. By scheduling the draft from October through December, the Kremlin ensures that these new conscripts will complete their basic training right as spring military operations typically intensify. This creates what military planners call a pipeline effect, continuously funneling fresh troops into the conflict zone to replace losses and maintain operational tempo. It's a brutal arithmetic of war that treats human lives as renewable resources rather than individual human beings with families, dreams, and futures. Now let's pull back the curtain on what this massive conscription truly reveals about the real state of Russia's military capabilities. When you see a nation resorting to drafting 135,000 civilians in just 3 months, you're not looking at strength, you're witnessing pure desperation on an unprecedented scale. The uncomfortable truth that Moscow doesn't want you to know is that their professional army, the highly trained force that invaded Ukraine back in 2022, has been effectively destroyed. What remains is a patchwork of hastily assembled units, poorly trained volunteers, and now these 135,000 conscripts who likely never imagined they'd be fighting in a real war. The evidence of collapse is everywhere if you know where to look. Independent analysts and intelligence agencies estimate that Russia has suffered between 250,000 to 300,000 casualties since the invasion began. That's not just killed, that's a combination of dead, wounded, and missing soldiers that represents nearly the entire pre-invasion ground force. Think about that for a moment. Virtually every professional soldier Russia had before this war began is now either dead, wounded, or so traumatized by combat that they're no longer effective fighters. This isn't speculation. These numbers come from multiple Western intelligence agencies that have been tracking Russian losses through satellite imagery, communications intercepts, and on-the-ground reporting. But the problems run deeper than just personnel losses. Russia's equipment situation is equally dire. Remember those massive columns of modern tanks and armored vehicles we saw rolling toward Kiev in the early days? Most of those are now smoking wrecks scattered across Ukrainian fields. Military analysts estimate Russia has lost over 2,000 main battle tanks. That's more than their entire active pre-war tank inventory. They're now pulling 50-year-old T-62 tanks out of storage museums and sending them to the front with minimal upgrades. When a modern army starts using equipment older than the soldiers operating it, you know they're in serious trouble. The logistics chain is breaking down too. There are numerous reports of conscripts being told to bring their own medical kits, sleeping bags, and even toilet paper because the military supply system can't provide basic necessities. Some units are reportedly receiving World War II-era Mosin Nagant rifles instead of modern firearms. This isn't the picture of a superpower. It's the portrait of a military institution that's been pushed beyond its breaking point and is now running on sheer momentum rather than professional competence. So why does this matter for the average Russian conscript being drafted right now? Because they're not joining the same army that invaded Ukraine 3 years ago. They're being thrust into a broken system that's struggling to provide even the most basic training and equipment. Multiple reports from Russian military bloggers, who often provide more honest assessments than official sources, describe training periods being cut from the standard 3 months to as little as 3 weeks. Some conscripts are reportedly receiving only 10 days of weapons training before being sent toward frontline positions. The deception begins the moment these young men report for duty. They're told they'll be serving in Russia proper, performing rear area security duties far from combat. But what they're not told is how easily those assignments can change with a single signature. The mechanism is simple yet devastating. Once they're in the military system, commanders pressure them to sign contract soldier agreements that effectively volunteer them for combat duty. Refusal often means harassment, poor living conditions, or threats of criminal charges for disobeying orders. It's coercion disguised as choice, and it's sending thousands of unprepared young men to their deaths. The social impact of this deception is tearing Russian society apart. In cities across Russia, but particularly in poorer regions where draft quotas are highest, you can feel the tension growing. Mothers organize quiet protest groups, sharing information about how to protect their sons. Telegram channels dedicated to helping young men avoid the draft have hundreds of thousands of subscribers. There's a pervasive sense of fear among families who thought their children would never have to experience the horrors their grandparents endured in World War II. The economic economic consequences are equally severe. Russia is experiencing a massive brain drain as educated professionals flee mobilization. Estimates suggest between 500,000 to 1 million Russians have left the country since the invasion began, most of them young men with higher education and valuable skills. This represents a catastrophic loss of human capital that will hamper Russia's economic development for a generation. The ones who can't leave, the poor, the rural, the less connected, are the ones being sent to fight. This creates a dangerous social divide that could have long-term political consequences for the Kremlin. On the battlefield, the results of this desperate conscription are predictably tragic. Ukrainian soldiers report that newly arrived Russian units often lack basic combat skills. They describe enemies who don't know how to properly clear buildings, coordinate fire, or even maintain their weapons. These aren't professional soldiers, they're civilians in uniform, and they're dying in shocking numbers because of it. The average life expectancy for a newly arrived Russian soldier in some of the hottest combat zones is reportedly measured in weeks, sometimes even days. The psychological toll is immeasurable. While official Russian sources rarely discuss combat stress or PTSD, the evidence suggests they're facing a mental health crisis of epic proportions. Soldiers returning from the front, those lucky enough to survive, often describe scenes of pure horror. Units being wiped out in hours, inadequate medical care, and commanders who view soldiers as disposable resources. These stories are spreading through Russian social media despite government efforts to suppress them, creating a growing undercurrent of discontent that could eventually threaten social stability. Meanwhile, the Kremlin continues to pretend everything is going according to plan. State television shows carefully staged segments of happy conscripts receiving their uniforms and marching in neat formations. Official spokespeople dismiss reports of problems as Western propaganda, but the reality on the ground tells a very different story. One of a military that's sacrificing its future to sustain a war it cannot win, and a government that's willing to destroy a generation of young men rather than admit failure. The international implications are equally concerning. A desperate Russia that feels it has nothing left to lose becomes increasingly unpredictable and dangerous. The use of nuclear weapons, once considered unthinkable, now gets discussed in Russian state media as a legitimate option if conventional forces continue to fail. Cyber attacks against Western infrastructure become more likely as Moscow seeks ways to compensate for military weaknesses. The stability of the entire international system is being threatened by the Kremlin's refusal to face military reality. What we're witnessing is perhaps one of the greatest tragedies of the 21st century. The systematic destruction of a generation of Russian youth for a war that serves no rational purpose. These 135,000 conscripts aren't just numbers. They're someone's children, someone's friends, someone's dreams for the future, and they're being sacrificed not for national defense but for the preservation of one man's political legacy and the imperial fantasies of a small elite that will never see the inside of a trench. The world watches with growing concern as this tragedy unfolds. Western intelligence agencies monitor Russian troop movements closely, aware that desperation could lead to unpredictable actions. Humanitarian organizations prepare for the inevitable flood of casualties, both physical and psychological, and Russian families pray that their sons will be among the lucky ones who survive this nightmare, forever changed but at least alive. As the autumn leaves fall across Russia, they're accompanied by the falling dreams of 135,000 young men who thought they had their whole lives ahead of them. Their stories may never be properly told, their sacrifices may never be honestly acknowledged, but their fate will shape Russia's future for decades to come. And that's the real cost of this conscription, not just in rubles or equipment, but in lost potential, broken families, and a national trauma that will take generations to heal. The ripple effects of Russia's massive conscription campaign extend far beyond its borders, creating shockwaves that are fundamentally reshaping global security architecture and international relations. When a nation of Russia's size and nuclear capability becomes this desperate, this unpredictable, the entire world holds its breath. What we're witnessing isn't just a regional conflict anymore. It's becoming a stress test for the entire post-Cold War international order, and the results should concern every nation that values stability and peace. Let's start with NATO's perspective, because what's happening in Russia right now is causing both concern and strategic recalculations across alliance headquarters in Brussels and national capitals from Washington to Warsaw. On one hand, the visible degradation of Russia's conventional military forces provides some strategic comfort. The much-feared Russian steamroller that haunted NATO planners for decades is proving to be far less formidable than intelligence assessments suggested. The loss of experienced personnel, modern equipment, and institutional knowledge represents a significant reduction in Russia's ability to threaten NATO territory through conventional means, at least in the short to medium term. However, this assessment comes with enormous caveats that keep military strategists awake at night. A wounded bear is often more dangerous than a healthy one, and Russia's conventional weakness increases the likelihood it might rely more heavily on its nuclear arsenal and asymmetric capabilities. We're already seeing signs of this shift in Russian military doctrine and state media rhetoric, where nuclear threats have become increasingly normalized in public discourse. This creates a dangerous escalation dynamic that NATO must navigate with extreme caution, balancing necessary support for Ukraine against the risk of triggering a broader confrontation. The quality of Russian forces that NATO might eventually face has also dramatically changed. Instead of the professional, well-equipped soldiers they trained to counter for decades, NATO would now confront a mass conscript army with questionable training, morale, and equipment. While this might seem like an advantage on paper, it actually creates new challenges. Poorly trained soldiers with advanced weapons can be more unpredictable and more likely to make catastrophic mistakes that could accidentally trigger wider conflicts. The reduction in professional leadership means less control over battlefield actions and greater potential for war crimes and atrocities that could force NATO responses. For the United States specifically, the Russian conscription represents both a strategic opportunity and a profound warning. The opportunity lies in watching Russia exhaust its military and economic resources in a conflict that weakens a primary geopolitical competitor. Every tank destroyed in Ukraine, every soldier killed or wounded, every ruble spent on replacing losses represents capacity that won't be available to challenge American interests elsewhere. The staggering scale of Russian losses, which some analysts compare to the Soviet experience in Afghanistan but compressed into a much shorter time frame, has set back Russian military modernization by at least a generation. But the warning is equally important. The United States is watching how modern warfare evolves in real time, and the lessons are sobering. The effectiveness of Western training methods, intelligence sharing, and equipment has been clearly demonstrated, validating decades of military investment and alliance building. At the same time, the durability of authoritarian regimes and their willingness to absorb enormous casualties presents a troubling model that other adversaries might seek to emulate. The conflict has highlighted the critical importance of defense industrial capacity, logistics networks, and the ability to rapidly scale military production, areas where the US and its allies have allowed capabilities to atrophy since the Cold War's end. For Europe, the implications are even more immediate and visceral. Nations bordering Russia, particularly the Baltic states and Poland, watch the conscription campaign with growing alarm. They understand that a Russia that feels cornered and desperate might eventually seek to compensate for its failures in Ukraine through aggression elsewhere. While NATO's Article 5 protection provides substantial deterrence, there's renewed urgency to strengthen defensive capabilities along the alliance's eastern flank. The massive increase in defense spending across Europe, particularly in Germany's historic pivot to rearmament, demonstrates how seriously the threat is being taken. For Ukraine itself, the conscription announcement represents a grim validation of their military's effectiveness and a sobering reminder of the challenges ahead. Ukrainian intelligence analysts likely view the 135,000 figure as both an admission of Russian weakness and a predictor of intensified combat in the coming months. The knowledge that Russia can still mobilize significant numbers of soldiers, however poorly trained, means Ukraine cannot afford complacency despite its battlefield successes. This reinforces the critical importance of continued Western military support, particularly advanced weapon systems that can help Ukrainian forces maintain their qualitative edge against Russia's quantitative advantage. The timing of the conscription is particularly significant from Ukraine's perspective. The October-December draft period means these new Russian soldiers will complete their abbreviated training just as winter conditions begin to ease in early 2026, setting the stage for potential new Russian offensives or efforts to reinforce collapsing defensive lines. Ukrainian military planners are almost certainly developing strategies to counter this influx, likely focusing on targeting Russian training facilities, logistics networks, and command structures to degrade the effectiveness of these new units before they ever reach the front lines.